Faith versus science. How come existence exists? How can there be something instead of nothing? If God created everything, then who created God? Our human logical thought process leads us to conclude that nothing should exist, because there seems to be no ultimate mechanism to initiate existence, at least none that we can imagine, and yet from observation and our own conscious awareness, we understand right away that this logical conclusion is wrong, and this forces us to have faith in the unexplainable, and what seems to be, finally, unreasonable and illogical. How do we deal with this ultimate singularity? If this question does not profoundly disturb you, then you don't understand the question. You have not given the question itself the attention that it deserves, for if you had, then like so many theoretical physicists, it would be, most of all, the question that keeps you up at night. The more that this question is pondered, the more wonky, shaky, and unstable one becomes. It is inescapable. It might possibly be the biggest question anyone can ever ask. Traditionally, it is said, God is that without which there would be nothing at all. So, on this question of faith and science, there are overlapping groups of people. Faith is believing in something that cannot be directly observed, but for which there is plenty of corroborating evidence. Credulity is belief without evidence, of which all levels of faith contain varying degrees. It turns out that the word science can be a tricky one. It's a branch of knowledge or study dealing with a body of facts or truths systematically arranged and showing the operation of general laws, the mathematical sciences. Systematic knowledge of the physical or material world gained through observation and experimentation. Dictionary.com. There is one group of people who say that intelligent design theory is a pseudoscience, because it cannot be mathematically measured or described that way. There is no exact measurement of it, and there is an element of religiosity to it. But then there is a second group of people who are saying that certain historical sciences, like archaeology and forensic science, do have a way of distinguishing the hallmarks of intelligent causation from just blind natural processes, and therefore, we can also apply the same logic to the universe with its physical laws and biology, and infer that it is designed. But there is a third group of people who say that intelligence is not a relevant demarcation for something being scientific or not, but rather it is distinguishing the natural from the supernatural that is important, whether intelligent or not, because science is only about measuring the natural, or describing the physical. So as long as it's a physical being that designed something, this does not violate the definition of science, because it happened within the natural laws of the universe. However, there is a fourth group of people who are saying that the historical sciences have an element of religiosity to them. The Big Bang, or however the universe began, and whatever caused the universe, had to be from something outside the physical universe, and therefore is in some sense supernatural and unobservable. The physical laws that we can observe and measure are so precisely balanced and fine-tuned to enable atoms, stars, galaxies, and planets to form, and also carbon and complex molecules, and especially laws requiring such ultimate precision that allows for DNA molecules, firstly to exist, and secondly, a precision in the laws that causes the DNA molecules to exactly have a helical coiling compact structure, to make multicellular life possible, and this points to the intelligent design of it all, both laws and intricate structures. Then there is the fifth group of people who say that we cannot ultimately determine whether the primary cause of the universe was intelligent or not, because there might be an infinite number of other universes, all with their own different set of physical laws, and, perhaps, it's inevitable that our universe just happens to be the right one for life to exist. So our universe is just one of an infinite number of variations on a theme, and, if true, It's no surprise our universe just happens to have exactly the precise variations in its laws of physics, required for life to exist, because it emerges from an infinitude of possible variations, that either have existed, or do exist. We are the winners, in an infinitely large cosmic lottery, called the multiverse. And maybe, it was inevitable, that there was a universe just like our one, that turned out right, so that everything might have evolved to its current state of complexity, from that. Then there is another group of people, who were bound to ask, but how is there a multiverse in the first place? What generated that? They speculate, that there might be some multi-dimensional realm, from which universes form like bubbles. So, believing in an infinite number of other universes that cannot be observed and proven to exist, is just as religious as believing in God, as a creator, because neither can be observed or measured. So you need to choose, which past eternal uncreated creative entity you want to believe in, as an ultimate explanation for everything you see around you. Then there is another group of people that say, that the multiverse idea is the biggest violation of the Occam's razor principle in the history of modern science, because of its extravagance, because science is better, when there are, razor-thin explanations, simple ones, when all competing explanations for something have not yet been proven true. It doesn't even begin to explain the ludicrously precise initial conditions that the Big Bang would have needed to produce our finely balanced universe. Therefore, the simpler explanation, they say, is, we must assume that the laws of physics exist out of necessity, that there is no way they could not exist, and are not contingent on anything at all, neither God, nor a multiverse of infinite actualities, but that the laws of physics are just simply there, because they have to be. There is no other way they can be. And they must have always existed. And so we need to come up with a theory of everything, to explain why all the universal laws can only be that way, from which upward evolution might happen. Confusing? Many people are confused by these points of view. So, is there a kicker argument that can break up all this confusion? If the capacity of our mind is too limited to understand any type of past eternal creator, be it natural or supernatural, non-intelligent or intelligent, how can we distinguish which one of them is plausible? Since we are not capable of understanding how existence exists, how there can be something rather than nothing, how do we come at this question of ultimate causation of reality, if our puny, finite, three-dimensional, physical brains can never comprehend the past eternal existence of anything? Another group of people cites the biblical claim, at Romans 1, verse 20, that the reality of God's existence can be proven by looking at the creation. For a lot of people, this is satisfactory. But how does such an argument stand up against the multiverse argument? Well, how about the house analogy? Every house is constructed by someone, but he who constructed all things is God. Hebrews 3, verse 4. Is that sound logic? Can I imagine any situation where a house would get constructed by random chance, due to only natural processes? The answer would most likely be no. But another group of people retort, but houses are not growing and constantly changing and self-replicating, like living things are. Living things, on incredibly rare occasions, might be capable of emerging and changing for the better, and many other new things would form over time from it all. And so, we are back to square one again. So some people think it pointless to speculate about the primary beginning of the universe, anything outside the universe, and even how life began within our universe, because such things are probably unknowable, too complicated, or ultimately, might not be understandable. And so, in an attempt to find out what we can know, they speculate that because we live in a blind, pitiless and indifferent universe, containing evil and suffering, and no divine intervention has yet been observed stopping that, instead of an intelligent designer, maybe some things within our universe can upwardly change or upwardly evolve, that things might sometimes gain more functions, and build up more and more functional complexity over time, by some natural means. So according to this idea, there is not only survival of the fittest, but also the arrival of the fittest, due to blind natural processes, one of which might be natural selection, of which evil and suffering might be a necessarily and intrinsic part, whether it be survival of the fittest universe, the survival of the fittest combination of self-replicating molecules, if that was at all possible, or the fittest life form's genetic mutation winning out and surviving. And so from this exclusively naturalistic viewpoint, they extrapolate back in time and speculate that maybe everything might have evolved from simpler beginnings, and therefore perhaps speculation about God is not needed as part of the explanation. In this view, quantum fluctuations can eventually evolve into humans, or at least it might have happened that way once, in one definite place, within an infinitely large cosmos. However, there are other groups of people who are skeptical of unproven naturalistic ideas, but only accept what empirical observation can tell them in the laboratory, which includes a principle known as the entropy law. It is a law mathematically explained by statistical mechanics, and it agrees with observable reality. It shows us that organized things become more and more disorganized over time. It tells us why everything decays over time. It demonstrates that everything is becoming more random and evenly mixed, more the same, less different, tending toward a state of maximum equilibrium, decaying into a state of maximum simplicity. Not only does it mathematically describe why heat always flows toward cold, and not the other way around, but also why houses eventually crumble and decay, and why they never reassemble when left to nature, and why observed life often devolves, why in everyday life we never observe it evolving upward to more complexity, and why people grow old and die. It might be that the entire universe eventually decays into a state of maximum simplicity, perhaps quantum fluctuations, or some kind of heat death, a maximum state of cold. And so, from this, the idea of quantum fluctuations evolving into humans seems like the most ludicrous anti-scientific extrapolation of all time. A rather credulous and superstitious belief. A more cheerful group of people say, just as the expanding universe tells us that it was more compacted in the past, perhaps implying the Big Bang theory of its beginning, so too, the law of increasing entropy tells us that the universe began more ordered, more differentiated, organized and complex. Therefore, when arriving at this obvious conclusion, an intellectually honest person is bound to ask, how is it possible to start with more order, more differentiation, more organization, more functional integrated complexity, when the rules of nature only go the other way? How can we resolve this paradox? Well, perhaps God is ultimately required, as a big part in the overall explanation of how things must begin more ordered, because no one, as far as we know, has witnessed anything evolving more functional complexity in its overall design, despite whatever story you have imagined into the fossil record, with its Cambrian explosion and its punctuated equilibrium. And so this rather seemingly rational group of people would say, it seems on balance, an intelligent God must exist, and there might be more hope for us than what was previously thought. But a certain group of people argues, well, hang on a moment, if an all-powerful past eternal super-intelligent God exists, then why did he create a universe in which evil and suffering exist? Surely, an infinitely capable being logically could have achieved making a universe without evil and suffering, if he wanted to. We must have overlooked something. But others object and argue that to create beings with free will, so that they are not just robotic automatons, that is why there has to be the possibility space of good and evil built into the universe. If beings with free will are intelligent enough to understand the instruction manual from their manufacturer, that should be sufficient enough to make free will meaningful. But another group of people says that free will is just an illusion, because every decision we make has a prior cause. Therefore, our decisions and actions are all predetermined, a result of action-reaction, cause and effect. So even though we like to think we have free will, we actually don't. But there is another group of people who say that quantum mechanics shows us that there is an uncertainty principle built into the fabric of reality, and a certain amount of it is not predetermined. Atoms are not the motionless, solid objects, like what we experience in everyday life, like chairs and tables etc., but they are composed out of discrete amounts of oscillating wave packets of energy. Whether it be an electron, proton, neutron or quark, or even a photon, the exact position or momentum of these particles is indeterminate. It's only after the wave function collapses that you can make a definite statement about anything. Until you've observed it, there was no predetermined outcome. Therefore, Judas Iscariot was not predestined to become the son of destruction. But another group of people says that this idea makes no sense if you believe God can predict things thousands of years into the future, but a person's comparatively short part of their future is not predetermined. That seems inconsistent if the outcome of other things can be determined, or predicted, by God thousands of years in advance, and so it is argued that the idea of God's foreknowledge shows how difficult it is to then believe that we ultimately have free choice. Therefore, from this idea, it might seem to some people that Judas Iscariot was predestined to betray Jesus and become the son of destruction. It seems that the future has, in a sense, already been written, and, if that were true, it might not appear fair for those with a bad future. But another group of people says that God has not written everyone's future, because God is love. According to the biblical narrative, He loves us, and would never deprive us of being able to choose a good future. But how do we reconcile the concept of a loving God with God's foreknowledge? How is it possible, under such circumstances, for us to truly have free will? One possible resolution to this problem is to suggest that things become more predictable at larger scales, and completely predetermined beyond a certain threshold of largeness in scale of complexity, because all the overwhelming small-scale indeterminate details become insignificant, and cause the larger-scale probabilities to collapse into each other, making the larger outcomes predictable, similar to how the unpredictable indeterminate quantum world, that is the micro-world of subatomic particles, at some unknown fuzzy threshold, adds up and averages out to be the larger measurable predictable classical macro world of cause and effect that we are familiar with in everyday life, and the overall prediction that was made and its outcome does not account for all the astronomical amounts of microscopic indeterminate details that added up and average out to the final, larger, predetermined outcome. At this larger level of reality, only God can change its outcome. And so these indeterminate details, that are at the micro level, the subatomic level, of reality, account for our consciousness, because the brain is largely quantum mechanical, and this is significant for our decision-making ability, and therefore we can have free will, and make our own decisions, partially independent of the cause and effect that takes place at the classical macro level of reality, that we are familiar with in our everyday lives. Another group of people says that because there are more H2O molecules in a cup of water than there are cups of water in all the oceans of the earth, so too, the universe is partially indeterminate, just like a river has lots of turbulence, dynamic randomness, and unpredictability, but its general direction of flow is predetermined. Then God interferes and tinkers with history, so that His prophecies become fulfilled, like changing the course of a river. Therefore, the son of destruction didn't necessarily have to be Judas. He was not specifically named in the prophecy, it could have been anyone, but Judas was the one who freely chose to be the traitor of Christ, and he chose to be a disloyal greedy opportunist, for some short-term gain, at the expense of his friendship, at the expense of the life of his friend, and at the expense of the long-term future existence of himself. He decided that all of it was worth only 30 pieces of silver. He freely decided on what value he was going to place on loyalty, friendship, and human life. But what makes it far worse is, he knew, from empirical evidence, from experience, that Jesus was no ordinary man, but the Son of the Almighty God, Jehovah. It was inexcusable. And so it is said, that Satan and the demons will receive the same fate as Judas, that of everlasting destruction, future permanent non-existence. Many make the logical conclusion, that a loving God would have to provide free parameter space for good and evil to be possibilities, because love requires risk from allowing free will to exist. If things do go wrong, an unlimited all-powerful super-intelligent God, being a God of love, is ultimately capable of righting all wrongs that might emerge from free will, resurrecting those who have died throughout human history, and restoring everything to being new and perfect, kind of like reprogramming and rebooting a computer simulation. And so all the pain and suffering will be worth it, in the end, for the greater good. Hence, the biblical-based doctrine of original sin, and that the human race inherited the corruption and the ransom sacrifice, enabling the ultimate redemption of repentant humans. Some people like to say that the end does not justify the means, but that cannot be used as a blanket statement, because, in many cases, it does have justification. Everything is a means to an end. Hard work can be painful, but a person is willing to do it for the reward. God is willing to go to a lot of trouble and pain to have a world full of sentient beings who are self-aware and who freely choose to be good. So it's ultimately not the survival of the fittest, but more specifically, the survival of the good. Hence the need for God's great day of Armageddon. Good and bad are not compatible, the same way that light and darkness have nothing to do with each other but are mutually exclusive. So it seems the only way possible to have a perfect world, without unnecessary suffering, you need to eliminate evil and spiritual darkness. There must be a united front against evil, and those who insist on practicing evil must not be allowed to remain in the world, so that they cannot hurt others around them anymore. Others might argue that it cannot be truly regarded as free will, with the threat of death hanging over your head for being disobedient. But it's hard to imagine that one would be unhappy with limits to their freedom in every case. Sane, sensible people understand that you need to respect the law of gravity, and not step over the edge of a cliff, just because you resent the lack of freedom, because you're not a bird and can't fly, by flapping your arms, but that does not necessarily mean you are not free in other ways. We are free to never service and maintain our cars, or to drive on the wrong side of the road, but that doesn't necessarily make it a good idea. So, freedom is a relative concept, and without laws, there is anarchy, disorder, disorganization, evil, suffering, bad forms of entropy, and death. It seems many do not want that. Others are uncertain of how much faith to place in some of those explanations about existence. But whether it is predetermined or not, whether we can understand the primary past eternal start of it all or not, one thing we can understand right now is the consistent effects we see from natural laws, and deduce certain distinctions from them, the foremost in the direction of change, that is only ever observed to be downward, toward more entropy. When we wind back the clock, we can legitimately extrapolate that everything in the universe, in the past, began more ordered. Science does not point us to a simple beginning. A simple beginning of things is only the unscientific denial of atheists. Whereas, science points us to a complex ordered origin theory of everything, derived from the entropy law. It is difficult to see how intelligence could not have been involved, somewhere in the process of things beginning, more organized. In everyday experience, with human-made things, when coded information is created, or when some mechanistic function begins its existence, we always observe, without exception, that an intelligent designer was by necessity part of its cause. Because of this, many argue, the mechanistic functions in all life, and the coded information in all life must have been intelligently created also, and to ignore the repeatable and consistent experience of such principles in this area, when applying this thinking to biological complexity and its possible origin, and believe otherwise, would seem to be blind credulity, if such a divine possibility is excluded from the inquiry, only based on the philosophy of exclusive naturalism, and thereby making it an argument by exclusion, and ignoring the well-recognized, legally established, principle of total evidence, and so, a divine foot should be allowed in the door. Both opposing viewpoints have their particular kind of religiosity. Using rational thought, logic, and critical thinking, it would seem that a past eternal intelligence is the ultimate singularity, for both science and religion. Whatever pronunciation you choose to name the intelligence, be it Jehovah, or something different, this is the singularity, at which science and faith have unreachable ultimate unification. Being human, it is hard to wrap our brains around such things. Let's go back to that question of all questions: how come existence exists? How can there be something instead of nothing? This most difficult of questions is what philosophers have been grappling with since time and memorial. Some call it the mystery of existence. Is it a scientific problem, or a philosophical one? Since our finite, puny, three-dimensional, material brains cannot comprehend it all right now, a leap of faith is required, or at least, an extrapolation of what we do know and comprehend, into the unknown, and incomprehensible. A logical leap of faith. Some people suspect that the suicide rate in society might, sometimes, be partially attributable to the bleak, hopeless outlook of the secular atheist philosophy. People who suffer from different forms of depression and mental illness, quite often not only logically understand the apparent ultimate futility of human existence, but also deeply feel the bleakness, emotionally associated with that idea. When God is taken out of the picture, that might, sometimes, be a tipping point for certain people. This might, for some, be a reason to closely analyze the question of an ultimate creator, because if we can logically show the possibility of God's existence, then we can have faith and hope. How is existence possible? Some physicists claim that the existence of our universe is just a brute fact. It is said that mathematical principles exist by necessity, and are transcendent of the physical universe, and have always existed and always will. 1 + 1 = 2, it always has, and always will, that is, before the universe existed, during the universe's existence, and, whether the universe remains in existence or not, it will always equal the number 2. They suggest that there might be found a mathematical argument that can show us that there is only one way a universe can exist, and no other. So they hope to, one day, come up with a theory of everything that will explain why all the physical laws are what they are, and how they must be necessarily so, and there is no other way they can be. And this might show that the question of why the universe exists might be ultimately meaningless, that there is no reason for why it exists, it just does, and has to, and there is no way that it cannot exist. Just as we might imagine in our own mind 3D space to exist by necessity, or how the logic of 1 + 1 = 2 does not seem, at first glance, to be contingent upon anything, so too, in this view, some might imagine the speed of light, the electromagnetic force, the strong and weak nuclear forces that regulate the structure of atoms, and the gravitational force, all might only exist one way by necessity, and no other. Many people object to this idea, and point out that going from 1 plus 1 equals 2 and then inferring that the universe's existence is meaningless, is an invalid extrapolation, as the logical leap is incomplete and unsatisfactory, with too many unproven ill-defined assumptions, and it disagrees with other things that have been discovered. Relativity theory, and Big Bang cosmology, suggest that space and time perhaps did not always exist but had a beginning, so that is also a problem. Stephen Hawking asked the difficult question, why only this set of laws? Could there have been different laws? The entropy principle suggests that the universe started in a more ordered condition, and is running down toward a state of maximum disorder. So this also points to it all having a more organized beginning, and science has not discovered anything that does not begin more ordered this way. Consequently, other cosmologists strongly object to this idea of existence by necessity within the physical universe, and argue that there is more than one way a universe might have existed, that the values in the physical laws are arbitrary, and therefore all possible universes in principle might have existed, all having different variations of physical laws. Perhaps just as virtual particles are believed to pop in and out of existence at the quantum level, maybe, then universes can also pop into existence, and their uniqueness, and, more importantly, the functionality of the combination of their laws, will determine how long any of those universes can exist for. So according to this idea, there might be an infinitely large ensemble of varying universes. If some small fraction of these universes has the right balance of parameters to exist for longer than a nanosecond, then some minutely tiny fraction of those surviving universes might turn out right for life to exist in a relatively tiny minuscule place within them. The problem then is that this idea fails to explain why quantum laws exist in the first place, that is to say, how they got to be there. What generated a multiverse? Some prefer to believe that the quantum laws have always been there, and leave it at that. The other problem for the multiple universe idea is, nobody has any proven naturalistic explanation for what the cause of the various physical laws is, or why they have their specific strengths or values that need to be there to allow life, as we know it, to keep existing. The only thing everyone can agree on is that they are there because their effects are very real, perfectly consistent, and measurable. There has been no observation of the contrary. Are these precise values in the physical laws and constants contingent on some unknown principles, or must they have been arbitrarily put there, chosen deliberately, and precisely? No one has found a way to naturally test this, to get a satisfactory answer. The Earth is the only place that we yet know of that is not completely hostile to life, especially human life. The overwhelming majority of space will kill us. The Earth is minuscule, virtually insignificant, compared in size to the rest of the universe. So their zone of livability for humans is incredibly small, quite insignificant it seems, by comparison. Some have characterized the multiverse argument as the most extreme violation of the Occam's razor principle in the history of scientific inquiry. However, it is argued that believing in an infinite superintelligent creator is just as ad hoc an argument as believing in an infinite number of non-identical universes, and not a scientific solution to the problem of existence either, since the existence of such a creator also remains unexplained, and because of physicists' ambitions, they don't like loose ends, no matter how arrogant this may seem. But saying that God did it seems to only push the whole problem back one step further, the same way a multiverse does, and you haven't solved it that way either. How does one test the likelihood of any of these arguments being viable? So, the question of why there is not just absolute nothing, even an absence of quantum fluctuations, no time, no space, no matter, and no energy, instead of something, remains unsolved. Some advocate that the only way you can make a distinction of viability in any of these ideas is by examining the entropy principle, the reason for why things decay. Some intelligent design advocates and creationists say that this is the powerful argument for intelligence is necessary, not to explain how the primary cause of it all exists, because we can't, but it does at least eliminate other ideas, involving increasing complexity of function, with empirical observation, since it is a repeatable experience within the framework of our universe, that only intelligence is observed to increase functional complex order, and there is no proven reason to think that it would be any different, anywhere else, within the observable universe either. It has been empirically demonstrated that either there is pre-existing information in a system, or pre-existing intelligence, to produce the emergence of observable increases in a complex function. The mathematical logic of statistical mechanics also agrees with this. Coded functional information has never been observed to spontaneously begin existing. This is a philosophical conundrum, because it can be asked whether complexity actually increased, or whether it was derived from already existing greater complexity, whether it be the information or the intellect, and therefore the problem of ultimate causation is still not solved, because the origin of the designer has not been properly accounted for, and yet the entropy law, and the complexity, are undeniably there. Is the primary cause of it all not subject to the entropy law? Although this is a logical extrapolation, it also seems to be a contradiction, because this conclusion violates all known natural laws, and yet, despite such logic, the complexity undeniably exists. How do we escape such circular reasoning, without faith? Atheistic scientists claim to reject intellectual laziness. And they claim we should not just say, God did it, and give up. The problem with that idea is that it seems a little self-contradictory, because they hand-wave away the question itself of intelligent design, or purpose in the universe, as meaningless. It seems they have to frequently skip over the principle of increasing entropy, and so instead of having a God of the gaps argument, they prefer a meaninglessness of the gaps argument, essentially, a naturalism of the gaps argument. And this seems defeatist, and inconsistent, because the possible existence of the primary causation, in the idea of how things are so ordered, integrated, dynamic, and interesting, remains unexplained. So, either idea is religious. There is no escaping it. But only one idea agrees with experiments, a more complex beginning. And within the realm of human experience, we have only observed intelligence to be in the cause of more complex beginnings. Therefore, atheists are committed to believing in what disagrees with experiments and all human experience, namely their belief that things start simple and can somehow become complex over time, from blind natural processes, in a desperate attempt to prevent their worldview from collapsing in deepest humiliation. And that is why many scientists object, and say that such an idea is credulous, because every experiment that was ever done has either repeatedly shown the opposite to be true, or simply failed to show evidence for any kind of mindless increase in functional complexity without pre-existing input of higher information from elsewhere, from it being an open system. So such a hypothesis has, so far, shown itself wrong by science, because it is in contradiction to experimental evidence. The obvious question of how things started more complex then remains. And so we've hit a brick wall in naturalistic reasoning. Other physicists speculate that under certain conditions, perhaps outside the visible universe, or in other universes, the entropy law might not apply anymore, or time may run opposite, but there is no science to support this view. All these guesses, although interesting, remain unsubstantiated ideas, based on fuzzy, fanciful imagination. And so, to the chagrin of atheists, because we only observe that intelligence is required to create greater functional complexity, and no other process has been observed to produce functional complexity of any kind, it is suggested that this is what sets the intelligent design model apart and distinguishes it from all constrained naturalistic models, even if the existence of an ultimate designer might never be fully understood or explained, scientifically or mathematically. But for some people, this kind of logical faith within the domain of scientific inquiry is irreconcilable, and their only desperate retort is to suggest that those making that argument have in some way misapplied the second law of thermodynamics. But proper scientists refuse to be constrained, or muzzled, by such a narrow view, and to embrace the principle of total evidence, and free open inquiry. They will accommodate reasonable hypotheses, and reasonable faith, and remain open-minded to it, if it agrees with empirical scientific evidence that remains unfalsified. Believing, and knowing, are two different things. Is everything, ultimately the result, of pure unguided natural causes, or intelligent design? Are we all just walking lumps of dust, walking lumps of atoms, greater than the sum of our parts, or were we purposefully put together, with all our elaborate functional complexity, by a super-intellect? This seems to be a rational question, but is it a scientific question? Who cares how you define it? But some questions seem to defy logic. How is there something, instead of nothing? Some ask, if God exists, then who, or what, made God? An even tougher question to ask is, how come existence exists? So some things might remain beyond the capacity of the human brain to ever understand. Who knows? Science, the way it is understood today, by many, may not be able to reach an ultimate understanding of reality. Is science trying to reach beyond its tenure, and become a religion? But there are things that science has uncovered, so we can at least discuss what we do know, and what our limited brains can understand. Because galaxies appear redder than what they ought to, it seems to imply that most galaxies are moving away from one another, and so because of such observations, we're told that the visible universe, our region of the universe, started as an infinitely small dense dot, and suddenly expanded, and continued to expand over several billion years into what we see today. Marilyn Vos Savant, a Guinness Book IQ 228, creation skeptic, and famous Parade magazine correspondent said that we must be able to defend our arguments in a rational way, otherwise, all one has is an opinion. Opinions are a good starting point and may or may not be testable, but it is not scientific to impose them as fact. Many things once thought to be true have since been proven wrong. When Marilyn commented on the Big Bang and other scientific theories, she said, "That sounds just plain nuts, right? But so, you believe it? If so, how do you support your belief that the entire cosmos was once smaller than a polka dot? With a strong line of reasoning? Solid evidence? Anything at all? If you cannot, welcome to the world of faith. You're accepting what you've been told by those you respect." She further says, lots of science, far too much, is accepted on faith. She then says that imparting theories as facts slow scientific progress in ways that are not measurable. Parade, November 14, 1999, page 20. However, to be reasonable, there is compelling evidence that suggests that the universe is expanding, which thereby implies the reasonable assumption that it might have been a lot more densely compacted in the past. But do all who claim to be scientists humbly admit that this is an assumption? Do we have the right to take the next step, claiming it to be fact? It may be hard to say. One can only imagine how much further we would be now in our understanding, if old dogmas had not been held onto, against all contradictory empirical evidence at the time, simply because certain people thought their careers, lives' work, or egos felt threatened. Evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould, in 1999, released his book, Rocks of Ages. He posited that science and faith should ideally be realms of non-overlapping magisteria. He had hoped that this might stop the war between science and religion. He argued that they explained reality in separate ways and could not in principle criticize each other. He thought, naturalistic science does not determine morals and ethics, whereas religious appeals to supernatural explanations can. He argued that science has nothing definitive to say about whether the supernatural exists, because the position of methodological naturalism does not assume any supernatural causation of physical reality. However, this idea has many problems. If one confines themselves to the philosophy of exclusive naturalism, then you might not ask how natural evidence might point to a cause beyond nature. Therefore, this particular constraint is a demarcation that is manifestly arbitrary, a line that has been drawn in a chosen place, for purely subjective reasons, whereas a more objective line would be to, at least, allow the question for speculation. Some say that the reason for exclusive naturalism is, for methodological reasons only, so that scientific investigation can remain rational. Others think that when it comes to the origin of everything, this approach cannot remain rational. And so others argue that it is for anti-religious reasons that intelligent design is excluded. Therefore, others argue that it is because some do not like the idea of being accountable to God for their behavior. However, others object, and think that it is because some long-held religious beliefs have been scientifically debunked, and religious ideologies have failed in the past, causing much atrocities and suffering, and because of its bad track record, religion can no longer be trusted. However, others point out that it can be equally said that pseudo-scientific theories have been used also to justify evil atrocities. Yet others argue that all belief systems, either traditional religions or general philosophies, should not all be treated the same, and there is also plenty of unproven beliefs, not just traditionally religious ones, but also contained within science, speculations and hypotheses, and over time they get disproven, despite the popular consensus for those ideas being widely believed, and also them having been peer-reviewed. History is full of it. Prominent examples of the only types of observable evolution are microevolution, and various types of increasing entropy. All, imagined uphill, types of naturalistic evolution, have never been observed when tested, and these ideas remain refutable. These uphill beliefs remain purely speculative, and in disagreement with experimental evidence. Nevertheless, there seems to be a somewhat religious commitment to these fanciful ideas in some parts of the scientific community, particularly those who have abandoned rationality and embrace the willful ignorance of atheism. Others object to this viewpoint and say that they are merely trying to be scientifically rigorous in their investigation. However, it is difficult to imagine that such willful dismissal of repeatable experiments showing only downward processes can be viewed as anything else other than irrationally antagonistic. These quite often seem to be the very same people who criticize the various intelligent design arguments. But it's not always like that. On January 5, 2006, at a University of Michigan program, Eugene C. Scott, executive director at the National Center for Science Education, explored intelligent design, ID, posited as a new form of creationism that emerged after legal decisions in the 1980s hampered the inclusion of creation science in the public school curriculum. She said, in the 20-plus years since ID appeared, she claimed, at the time, that there had been no evidence of it being used to solve problems in biology. Although it was said that the scientific, scholarly part of ID had been a failure, the cultural renewal part of ID was a success, as supporters of ID sought restoration of a theistic sensibility in American culture to replace what they considered an overemphasis on secularism. She said that this idea that science is a war between intelligent creation advocates and atheistic evolutionists is a false dichotomy. So there is a mistaken notion, by some, that naturalism in science is exclusively the domain of atheism. This is simply not true. Both religious people who are scientists, and so-called non-religious scientists, both use the naturalistic methodology when making hypotheses or theories. Faith and science are quite often thought to be opposites by their very definition, But is this so? It is deserving of questioning, whatever anyone believes about God or evolution, because it always involves some type of faith. Hence we need to question whether the idea, faith versus science, is wrongly framing the problem, to begin with. Religion generally takes leaps of faith, and often assumes the supernatural, when attempting to understand reality. Science tries to take a skeptical, naturalistic approach to the problem, but also ends up taking leaps of faith, albeit naturalistic leaps, with certain unprovable speculations as well. There is a tendency in science to exclude the supernatural as an explanatory possibility, but this, too, then becomes a belief system, but that, in itself, doesn't make it wrong. Everyone, whether they are a scientist or anyone else, can only begin their searches for information, with some unprovable axiom, to try and infer other facts. This can only be recognized by belief. The scientific method is, ideally, supposed to make one assumption, and one assumption only, that the universe obeys a set of rules. But it does not provide an explanation of how those rules came to be there. Despite efforts to do so, it can only proceed by testing and observing the way parts of the universe behave. However, there are many, so-called, sciences, that break this set of principles, using untestable hypotheses, leaps of faith, to make certain theories work. Sometimes, it has worked, in the real world, but it very often fails, and requires revision. Not all science fails like this, because after much trial and error, much highly sophisticated technological achievements empirically bear this out. This was the outcome of many centuries of scientific discoveries being accumulated and utilized. As a result, you can walk around all day with a computer in the palm of your hand, fly an airplane, drive a car, and so on. But, what about the idea that the universe obeys a set of rules? Does that automatically presuppose that God does exist? According to traditional rules of science, if we cannot make an empirical argument as to whether he exists or not, then whether we are an atheist or a different type of religious person, we have broken the principle in the definition of science, that of only accepting a tested and proven idea as fact. At best, many scientists feel that we can only refer to it as a religious idea, but not a scientific one, even if it is labeled as being an unfalsifiable hypothesis. So, can we naturalistically infer the existence of an intelligent designer of the natural world, or is that taking things a little too far, in the science room? There are three basic types of naturalism. The first type is constrained to observable repeatable phenomena. This is often referred to as an operational science. Physics is the supreme example of this, because it relies on reproducible experimental evidence for its discovery of consistent natural laws and regularities. From this is derived the science of engineering. The second type is forensic, and uses physical clues to estimate a probable cause of a past event. These are often referred to as historical sciences. Archaeology, geology, and forensics are examples of this. Even though nature's regularities are taken into consideration, they are less accurate than operational science, but still often useful, but sometimes can also be misleading, because the data can be open to different interpretations. A chosen story is laid on top of the evidence a priori, then tested, but there can often be more than just one possible story of what the evidence might explain, so this is a problem with this kind of science. It can be difficult, perhaps impossible, sometimes, to make a distinction as to which story, hypothesis, belief, or philosophy provides the best explanation of the facts. The third type, we might call exclusionism. This is ideological, which often ignores repeatable evidence, so that one might continue with an idea, and exclude other unfalsified ideas, and instead attempt to rescue their falsified hypothesis with ad hoc ideas, or faith in imagined, hoped-for, future discoveries, to excuse contradictory evidence that would otherwise falsify it. Such disagreeable types of evidence are labeled paradoxes within such a worldview. A preconception is often read into the evidence from the start, and other explanations are philosophically excluded, sometimes for emotional reasons and, maybe, not logical ones. Creationists sometimes use Darwinism as a foremost example of this, and accuse portions of it as being a religious form of naturalism. But creationism is often accused of having similar issues. The former type of naturalism, physics, is more scientifically accurate than the latter, historical science, because of its more rigorous constraints and accurate reproducibility in the laboratory. Many consider physics to be the only true science, and the most reliable and accurate science. But historical science has proven its worth in many ways. Archaeologists have made discoveries that sometimes verify what is stated in Scripture, despite the many conjectures that are sometimes raised from it. So these different ways of investigating the world may seem like an overwhelming problem, for which many people are passionate about, for which some people get upset and distressed, and through the decades, the problem that has plagued people with uncertainty and fueled their doubts, sometimes in a perilous way, because of the hideous, ideologically driven human atrocities that have resulted. And you may be wondering, how likely is it that one method of inquiry is going to give us the right answer, more so than the other? What types of evidence are most reliable in being able to distinguish facts from only unsubstantiated speculation? If we abhor our own level of ignorance, how do we know what degree of certainty there is within any explanation of a particular phenomena, or to determine whether our own idea of how the world works is right? When listening to arguments between anti-religionists and those advocating religious faith, quite often you'll note the singular absence of scientific facts in the discussion and merely hear messages of religious bigotry and ridicule. It's important to point out that personal attacks upon religious beliefs or hypotheses are never equal to demanding scientific hard work and evaluation. Neither do weak, philosophical thoughts concerning the origin of the species, or an infinite multiverse, equate to proven physics or reality. Atheists, theists, scientists in general, regard faith in the science room tantamount to arguing from ignorance, by invoking a god of the gaps, or a naturalism of the gaps, to explain the yet unknown. According to some traditional rules, we are not supposed to make arguments from what we don't know, but only from what we can observe, measure, and test. No human has ever literally seen God with their eyes, or directly observed something being created via supernatural means. On the other hand, it makes no difference whether somebody is a scientist or not. No human has observed one kind of life macro-evolve into a higher kind of life form either. All we have is a series of anecdotes or non-definitive accounts. No one has ever been able to demonstrate how the overwhelmingly functional complexity found in the DNA and the self-reproducing machinery of a living cell can come about by mindless, natural processes from non-living chemicals. That is the vague concept known as abiogenesis. A very significant thing that modern science has revealed is, there is nothing simple about a cell. The extrapolation from microevolution, which is an observable process where variations of offspring within populations happen by those parents that interbreed, up to the macroevolution idea, which has not been observed, but is an imagined process, where changes over time of successive generations are, supposedly somehow, gaining more and more functional complexity, including more new properly functioning genetic information, has not been demonstrated, or conclusively verified by observational science, and certainly not through repeatable experiments, and therefore constitutes a leap of faith, albeit one based on anecdotal evidence, from fossils, geology, and various methods of trying to determine the ages of different things. In terms of the direction of evolutionary change, operational science has only established degeneration in living things, which is quite the opposite of the macroevolution hypothesis. So instead of saying the somewhat invalid statement, faith versus science, Perhaps we should frame a more valid argument, such as credulity versus science. Is it possible to have a neutral, that is to say, agnostic perspective, when scientifically investigating something, so that we can dispense with any prioritized worldviews that may affect the way we interpret data? Should science and religion be kept separate? Can they be positions of non-overlapping magisteria, or is there an area where they both intrude into one another's territory? Is one worldview better? Does the actual empirical evidence tend to point more in one direction than another? Is the inductive argument for design a scientific way of thinking? What about the denialistic, so-called, non-belief, worldview? Atheism. Does science even have the right to say whether there is, or isn't, a God? Is that even the role of science, in any situation? If not, then, where do science and faith overlap? A lot of people put their faith in science. Faith often involves believing in something that cannot be seen, but has other evidence that backs it up, and therefore it is not blind faith. So there is a clear distinction between faith and credulity. On the other hand, it is widely accepted by many that science requires hard data. For something to be truly scientific, it must be testable, observable, falsifiable, verifiable and repeatable, and able to make reliable predictions, calculations, at least when it comes to physics, practical application, or engineering. If we are skeptical, we cannot say the same thing about historical sciences, because no one alive today was around at the time of history, or prehistory, to observe what actually happened, and therefore any evidence about the age of something, or how it happened, in the distant past, is often purely forensic and is based on assumptions about past conditions, and often based on our present experience, and therefore can be open to various interpretations, opinions and worldviews. So there is a certain amount of faith in there, as well. We haven't been able to invent the time machine to travel back to the distant and remote past, to directly observe it. Even so, many have chosen to put their faith in the methodology. So, the science in this case is not exact, and, very often, debatable. Even if the limited experimental evidence agrees with the idea being hypothesized, it still often remains inconclusive and open to conjecture, and might often still just be considered a theoretical model and not an absolute truth. The same evidence can often agree with theories that disagree with one another. When it comes to evolution, virtually no one disputes that life is evolving, but whether life forms can evolve into something better, more complex and sophisticated, or if living things can only get worse, and degenerate, over time. That is the real fundamental question of the decades-long creation-evolution debate that needs to be asked, that an intellectually honest person will ask, and this is the question that should not be skipped over, or hidden, otherwise one should be suspicious, as to why. Regardless of people's belief, or disbelief, of there being a designing creative intelligence behind everything, you may wonder, just how important is a philosophy that is behind any idea? Are faith and science truly separate and distinguishable in such cases, or is there an overlap? Can we always eliminate all types of faith from a scientific investigation? No, we cannot. The famous physicist, Richard Feynman, spoke about the differences between merely knowing how to reason mathematically, and understanding how, and why, things are physically analyzed, in the way they are. He posits, what seems a typical example, that what people often say, is that for guessing, two theories, A and B, which look completely different psychologically, with different ideas in them and so on, but all the consequences that are computed are exactly the same. Both theories, A and B, even agree with experiments. Even though they sound different at the beginning, the consequences are the same. One can usually prove mathematically ahead of time that the logic from both theories can always give corresponding consequences. So how are we going to decide which one is right? Not by science, because they both agree with experiment, to the same extent that you can't distinguish one from the other. So even though the two theories have deeply different ideas behind them, both mathematically identical, then usually people say, science should say, that one doesn't know how to distinguish them, and usually that he's right. However, for psychological reasons, in order to get new theories, these two theories are very far from equivalent, because one gives a person different ideas, as opposed to the other. By putting the theory in a certain kind of framework, you get an idea of the change. You change something in a theory, but to find out what the corresponding change is, can be very complicated. It may not be a simple idea, because a simple change in one place can be a very different theory than a simple change there. In other words, although they are identical before the change, there are certain ways of changing something, which looks natural in one theory, which doesn't look natural in the other. So psychologically, we must keep all theories in our head, and any theoretical physicist who is any good knows 6 or 7 theoretical representations of exactly the same physics, and knows that they are all equivalent, and that nobody is going to be able to decide which one is right at that level, but he keeps them in his head, hoping that they will give him different ideas for guessing. The philosophy, or the ideas around the theory, that is, a lot of ideas that people will say, for example, I believe there is a space-time, or something like that, in order to discuss your analysis. These ideas change enormously when there are very tiny changes in the theory. Newton's ideas about space and time agree with experiment very well, but in order to get the correct motion of the orbit of Mercury, which was a tiny difference, the difference in the character of the theory with which you started was enormous. The math was so simple and perfect and produced definite results, but then you get something that produces different results, and it has to be completely different. You can't make imperfections on a perfect thing, you have to have another perfect thing. So, the philosophical ideas between Newton's theory of gravitation and Einstein's theory of gravitation are enormous. That is to say, the differences are enormous. What are these philosophies? These philosophies are really tricky ways to compute consequences quickly. A philosophy, which is sometimes called an understanding of the law, is simply a way that a person holds the law in his mind, so as to guess quickly at consequences. Some people have said, never mind the philosophy, just guess the equations, which is true for instance in the case of Maxwell's equations and other equations. By that way of reasoning, the problem is only to compute the answers so that they agree with the experiment, and it's not necessary to have a philosophy about the equation. Is that true in a sense? Yes and no. It's good, in a sense, that you guess the equation and you're not prejudiced in yourself, and you guess better. On the other hand, the philosophy might help you to guess better. It may be hard to say. For those people who insist, however, that the only thing that is important is that the theory agrees with experiment, let's imagine a discussion between an ancient Mayan astronomer and his student. The Mayans were able to calculate with great precision the predictions for eclipses, the positions of the moon in the sky, and of Venus, and so forth. However, they were done by arithmetic, where you count certain numbers and subtract certain numbers, and so on. There was no discussion of what the moon was. There wasn't even a discussion of the idea that it went around. There was only a calculation of the time when there would be an eclipse, or the time when it would rise, or when there would be a full moon, half moon, and so on. Just calculations only. Suppose a young man comes to the ancient Mayan astronomer and says, I have an idea. Maybe those things are going around, and there are balls like rocks out there, and I can calculate how they move in a completely different way, other than just calculating the time they appear in the sky. So of course the Mayan astronomer says, yes. How accurate can you predict eclipses? The young man says, I haven't developed the thing very far. The astronomer replies, but we can calculate eclipses more accurately than you can with your model, so you must not pay any attention to your idea, because this mathematical scheme is better. And so, there is a very strong tendency for people to say, against some idea that someone comes up with, where they say, let's suppose the world is this way, and you say to them, well, what would you get for the answer for such and such a problem? And he says, I haven't developed it far enough, and you say, well, we have already developed our ideas very much further, and we can get our answers far more accurately. So, it is a problem, as to whether or not to worry about philosophies behind ideas, said Richard Feynman. Even theoretical physics has philosophical beliefs that constantly need to be tested rigorously. Beliefs about origins are even more problematic. What do we make of hypotheses, philosophies, and beliefs? Modern science started out with the theological perspective, a belief in a perfect God, who created the ordered universe, with its infinite precision in its physical laws that sustains its complexity. Cosmos is originally a Greek word, meaning both order and world, because the ancient Greeks thought that the world was perfectly harmonious and impeccably put in order. As time has gone by, we now see some scientists with an atheistic perspective. There is a prior commitment to trying to explain the world in terms of natural causes only. This philosophy has worked well for many things. All the technology we see today might at first seem to bear testimony to this, but when we extrapolate this empirical naturalistic philosophy to only partially empirical historical science, the problems begin. And so there is debate as to whether a purely naturalistic approach will be able to sufficiently explain the origin of the universe, and the origin of life and consciousness. The intelligent design advocates believe that the existence of an intelligent designer is a necessity, as the primary cause of every natural and material thing in existence, and is the ultimate explanation for the order in the universe, and the intricacy of things we see in the natural world around us, and that natural material causes are insufficient, because such phenomena require finely balanced, finely tuned, natural laws, and also functional information and often irreducible integrated complexity and organization. And all natural processes, so far reproducibly observed in nature, are either repetitive, reiterative, or degenerative, but never creative of new and more complex previously non-existent functions. According to this argument, based on such observations, the conscious mind might be the only possible cause of information and functional complexity, and cannot only be the result of a purely material process, while the other viewpoint speculates the opposite. Which idea is more in agreement with repeatable empirical science and our experience? Does atheism require a higher amount of credulity here? Since the birth of modern science, scientists have been intrigued by how mathematically consistent the universal laws of physics are. In more recent times, information has been realized to have far greater importance for the existence of biological systems in nature. From an engineering point of view, a chemist's perspective, and a biologist's orientation, there is the baffling complexity of what is referred to as functionally specific digital information, found in the genetic code of a living cell, and the ultra-complex machinery that it sends operational commands to control and direct its functions, and all these different parts seem to be codependent on one another for their very existence. And what is more astounding is that the whole sophisticated thing makes copies, or reiterations, of itself. The ardent atheist will advocate that it only seems designed, and the appearance of design is ultimately an illusion, but this type of hand-waving seems, for a lot of people, to stretch credulity beyond reasonable limits. From a physicist's viewpoint, the argument that needs to be taken seriously is our seemingly fine-tuned universe, how all the laws and constants have apparent infinite precision. Scientists find it intriguing, what many refer to as the fine-tuning problem. All the forces and constants seem to be balanced at just the right infinitely precise values for the universe to be able to exist as we know it, which in turn enables atoms, stars, planets, complex molecules, and life as we know it, to be possible. These arguments are based on what seems to be overwhelming probabilities for intelligent design. Others choose to try and debunk this by putting forth the speculative idea of an infinite multiverse of actualities, perhaps numbering at least 10 to the power 500 individual universes, all containing their own set of different laws, and therefore, this multiverse processing an equivalent level of creative power as a superintelligent designer would have. Is this concept in the interests of scientific rigor, or just leapfrogging denialism? But even this bottomless tower of turtles, this infinite regress of causes, that might be a hypothetical implication of the multiverse hypothesis, or an anthropic principle of some kind, fails to explain certain types of complexities that are observed in living things, yet some prefer to believe it nonetheless. These phenomena, that might threaten to overthrow such an exclusively naturalistic belief, are described by biologist Michael B. He, who has focused attention to the empirical and testable features of biological systems, these phenomena that he collectively called irreducible complexity. Why? He, and others, have observed that many of these super-sophisticated, life-generating, life-sustaining, biological systems, appear to be fully integrated, interdependent on one another for their continued existence, and therefore, irreducibly complex. And for this reason, many qualified and reputable scientists and biologists are now rightfully asking the question of, if it is even possible, that they could ever have come together in the first place, from only purely non-intelligent gradual natural processes. It would be intellectually lazy, if the puzzle of this feature were ignored, or skipped over. Others are cautiously skeptical about the idea. They still view it as potential God of the gaps reasoning. Despite such skepticism, no one has come up with any complete logical pathway for a naturalistic model that has the necessary amount of explanatory power and falsifiability, nor any repeatable experiment to support a purely naturalistic approach to the problem. So, rationally speaking, it would seem that one needs to be at least equally skeptical of this philosophical position of exclusionary naturalism and atheism as a starting point of inquiry, when no such fully developed gradualistic account can be envisaged, let alone proven, when there is no proof of concept from the ground up. So it seems to be more the problem of one kind of faith versus another kind of faith, and one kind of science versus another kind of science. Toward the end of his life, in 1988, Richard Feynman famously quoted on his blackboard, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." A very humble and intelligent statement indeed, and completely honest in scientific terms. It has become accepted by many as a scientific principle. Why is there so much order in the universe, and here on planet Earth? Why isn't there just randomness, instead? Why not just an even distribution of energy, or particles? Or for that matter, why particles, at all? Is it even possible to get any functional complex order without an intelligent agency? Is it wrong for a scientist to ask such a question? Is the mainstream scientific tradition of methodological naturalism, in this case, being turned into a fallacy of exclusion, instead of having the principle of total evidence and open inquiry? Do we just take for granted the stability of the materials of which we and our world are made of? Such a situation seems inexcusable. Is the God hypothesis untestable? Atheists sometimes like to claim that their position is not one of faith, but one of disbelief, but this is self-refuting logic, because even choosing to disbelieve is, in itself, a belief system, a worldview, and therefore an article of faith, because it requires another adequately alternative belief to justify the disbelief. In modern times, some have replaced a belief in God with a belief in an infinite multiverse. This goes along with the belief that something can come from nothing, and complexity in biology, similar to what we know of in machinery and computer code but vastly more complex in living things, can emerge somehow from randomness in the chemistry, without intelligent direction. atheists still need to believe in something past eternal, if only natural, and by definition, have to be committed to these naturalistic beliefs, for their ideology to at least seem remotely tenable. Are these exclusively naturalistic beliefs then faith or credulity? Rational people, true scientists, cannot simply skip over such beliefs that are contrary to the observed natural world in their investigations. And yet, it seems that many do, and this is strange. But scientists are ideally supposed to be unbiased and rational, so that they can follow the evidence wherever it leads them, regardless of whether they like it or not. Some scientists of recent times, who many people view as atheistic, have stated that they don't like to be labeled that way. They prefer to simply be viewed as skeptical scientists, or agnostics, because in their view, anything above and beyond that is outside the scope of science. Only an agnostic is even close to being a non-believer in anything, although even they will put their faith and trust in some things too. The real test of faith is a person's actions. If you get inside a car and drive it, if you board an airplane and allow yourself to be transported by such things, then you have demonstrated a degree of faith in them, and the people who designed and built such things. It can be much simpler than even that. You can just walk out your front door. Or you can simply get out of bed in the morning. So nobody is agnostic in the absolute sense. In the more traditional religious sense, the Bible also teaches that faith without works is dead. In fact, the Bible encourages a person to test their faith by living in harmony with it and observing the results. So in some sense, it might be viewed as a testable model to live by. It might perhaps even be likened to a properly conducted experiment, with a control subject, yourself, and lots of variables, others who choose not to live by the biblical faith, and then observe and compare the results, and in doing so, test its wisdom. Where, then, do you draw the line between what to believe and what not to believe? At what point does doubt become reasonable or unreasonable? Atheists have chosen to stay within the philosophy of naturalism. The atheists base their worldview partly on what they regard to be an absence of evidence, advocating evidence of absence for intelligent design, and they rely on a hypothesis of blind undirected natural processes, such as chemical evolution, and Darwinian macroevolution, via natural selection, genetic changes, and the possibility of yet unknown processes, which is generally regarded as naturalism of the gaps, to try and explain how life, including us, came to exist, that is to say, how things, in some hypothetical and yet unknown way not yet directly observed, progressed from molecules to man, perhaps via some, as yet, unproven, unobserved, anti-entropic process. Evolutionist, and famous atheist, Richard Dawkins, expresses his faith, or lack thereof, depending on how you prefer to characterize it, in saying that what looks like design in living things is merely an illusion, and purely mindless natural processes, like natural selection and genetic changes, are responsible for their existence. However, another very prominent atheist, Antony Flew, abandoned atheism toward the end of his life, as science had revealed more of the truly integrated complexity of living cells, the astounding absence of gradualism in the fossil record, and other things that were hard to explain naturalistically too, especially syntactic code in DNA, and protein folding. Even atheist cosmologist Fred Hoyle admitted that his atheism was shaken by the incredibly precise resonance of the carbon atom, for allowing life as we know it to be possible. Some people want to fool you into believing that what they are saying is factual and proven beyond all doubt. TV programs are notorious for firmly promoting this kind of unproven dogma. The abiogenesis dogma, and the macroevolution dogma, might be the two most prominent examples of these unsubstantiated just-so stories. People on either side of both opposing arguments have claimed that their belief, or disbelief, is logical and rational, and some even claim that their worldview is scientifically established. How would an agnostic be convinced of that? Intelligent design theory is generally dedicated to refuting, or falsifying, such a notion of a Darwinian type of evolutionary belief system. ID has been characterized, by some, as being a pseudoscience, because it is said by such ones, that it relies on the God of the gaps, for its explanations. Some have accused it of being an argument from ignorance, even though it uses a well-accepted method in mainstream science to detect and infer intelligent causation. It is compelling enough, for some have been trying to refute it. On the other hand, the atheistic belief system, or non-belief system, is fully dependent on some kind of believed Darwinian undirected random materialistic naturalistic evolutionary hypothesis for its foundation, to justify its plausibility. We might impartially call this as relying on a naturalism of the gaps argument, that is to say, ideas that have not yet been irrefutably verified empirically or repeated experimentally, and therefore, this could also be viewed, in some sense, as religious. It has been said, by certain renowned scientists, that belief in God should not be allowed in the science class, or the laboratory, because, when something cannot as yet be explained, we should not simply just say that God did it, without doing the science to find a natural explanation of how it works, and therefore not being tantamount to intellectual laziness. This idea is generally referred to as not appealing to the God of the gaps for a scientific explanation. A God of the gaps explanation or any other naturalistic gap filler, which doesn't eliminate ignorance, is considered to be an ad hoc methodology for science. That is to say, an afterthought, and an invalid shortcut, and also religious. Some feel that for us to be truly scientific, arguing whether God did it or not, misses the objective, that of having a logical rationale, a testable and observable approach to solving a problem or answering a question, about how some particular aspect of the natural world functions, and by doing so, this, in itself, neither affirms nor denies the existence of God. But then again, perhaps it can reveal something about the possible existence of a creative conscious entity. Which opinion is correct? Is that true though? If a scientist believes that God did it, as many do, is that going to stop the person from trying to find out how something works in nature? Does leaving the God question out of it make one intellectually superior? Does it make any difference at that level? And if there is a difference, does it have a positive or negative effect on scientific inquiry? Many scientists also have a belief in God. Does this make them intellectually lazy? Will they not want to find out how God did it, or how God has set things up to function, if that is their belief? Does anyone have the right to say what a scientist should, or should not believe? Which belief is more likely to lead a scientist in the right direction? Which idea will cause a scientist to ask more of the right questions? Richard Dawkins decided about belief in whether God exists or not. He posits that people want to believe in God for emotional reasons, but not rational ones, because nobody likes the idea that they are going to die one day, and therefore, the belief in God is an emotional way of dealing with this unpleasant thought. But this way of thinking has neither proven nor disproven the fundamental question, and there are of course, many counter-arguments to this idea. Disbelieving in the existence of God is also emotional, from fear of disappointment, or ridicule, or perhaps, the idea of divine judgment. Nonetheless, strangely, some people within the scientific community are trying very hard to disprove the existence of God. Falsifiability is a tenet of all scientific ideas, and yet such people often claim that the God hypothesis is unfalsifiable, but criticize it as though they are trying to falsify it, which seems rather absurd and contradictory. The disturbing question is, why is the existence of God so objectionable? Is it purely for reasons of scientific methodology that some are doing this? Is it purely just for the reasons of attempted falsification and scientific rigor? If the existence of God turned out to be true, would it be bad news in the minds of such people, and if so, why? Or if not, then why not? For most people, the ultimate goal of scientific investigation is for practical and engineering purposes. However, for others their philosophy is about finding an explanation about the origin of life, and perhaps, even a determination as to whether the existence of the universe, and life, has a purpose. Advocates of intelligent design assert that their theory is based purely on science and does not rely on a religious belief for it to stand up. However, they have said that they don't deny the theological implications of the theory. ID advocates posit that there is physical empirical evidence in nature that demonstrates that Darwinian evolution is a modern-day myth. So, the claim is, they put forth both the positive and negative arguments for their position. Conversely, we see implicit faith in the theory of Darwinian evolution by large parts of the scientific community, and some even fervently assert that non-intelligent Darwinian, upward, evolution is a proven fact. With almost religious certainty, this dogma axiomatically finds its way into the science room, where rationality, objectivity, and non-biased research are essential. Usually, this is because respected scientists or textbooks have stated something to give the impression that this is the case. But is it really the case? Is the claimed non-intelligent evolution of all life a scientific fact? Has it been proven that life can be the result of random natural processes, random chemicals self-organizing, natural selection, or mutations at work? Has the hypothesis of upward evolution been proven scientifically, beyond all reasonable doubt, using the scientific method of repeatable experiments? Is the theoretical process, where one kind of animal changes into an entirely different one, over supposedly millions of years and many generations, testable, observable, falsifiable, verifiable, and repeatable? Is it irrefutable? Is it proper science to simply accept this hypothetical idea, without question? It would seem not. Has life ever been observed spontaneously developing from non-living material, even under the most controlled, ideal conditions, of a laboratory? No? Has it then been observed to be complex enough to be capable of self-replication or variable reiteration, and also able to reproduce and multiply unassisted with successive generations in a given habitat? The answer of course is no. So, could it be said that this idea is, at present, just a belief system, a superstition, or a hypothesis at best, and not a proven fact? That, surely, is reasonable. No one, in the laboratory, has ever created life from non-life. Is variation a result of genetic mistakes, or is it designed and programmed into the system, or perhaps a bit of both? Does anything ever get more complex in its functionality without intelligent direction? Has this idea ever been properly tested? So it comes down to this. If it is not falsifiable, then it's an argument from ignorance. That is to say, if there is no way of proving it either true or false, then it is an argument from ignorance. It seems that for agnostic scientists, the existence and non-existence of God are both arguments from ignorance, because science requires skepticism and evidence. However, there is disagreement on both sides, atheists and theists, about which one fits this philosophical description. Atheists argue that if you can't see it or detect it, then you can't believe in such a thing, and in their way of thinking, God is not detectable. ID advocates say that design can be detected, using known established methods of inquiry. In this view, the existence of a designer, creator is falsifiable, verifiable, according to scientific rules, but science can only identify the hallmarks of intelligent agency. It cannot always identify the designer. It is often said that in science, we should not argue from what we don't know, because it is tantamount to dogmatism, and lacks humility, but we should only make arguments from what we do know, from what is proven by repeatable tests. The religiously inclined scientist Sir Isaac Newton said that what we know is a drop. What we don't know is an ocean. You would be hard-pressed to view this any other way than being humble. And yet Newton established a scientific method still used today, and so he was able to make distinctions between the proven facts and his beliefs. He properly respected the demarcation between faith and science. One thing that might seem puzzling to many is to see those people claiming to be atheists who argue that science and religion should be kept separate, but then those very same people go and debunk religious beliefs under the cloak of non-existent scientific authority. Then, when religion uses science, using an observable phenomenon or phenomena to support a belief, they complain about it, as though science has been violated, but at the same time, they have been attempting to hijack science, with their own unsubstantiated hypotheses, with their atheism, when in reality, the science does not support their position. Of course, most of what we have been discussing here so far is deeply philosophical. We've discussed a wide range of arguments and questions, many that most people think up by themselves. But we of course want to distinguish the facts from just belief systems, and at times, from manifest superstitions. So what do the honest scientists say? What does the empirical evidence show? Where does it point? Which worldview best agrees with observational science, observable, repeatable, empirical science, real science? Here is a question that is quite possibly closer to the real argument: should scientific faith and religious faith be kept separate? Moreover, can they be? Does science invalidate every form of religion or belief? Or is it sometimes purely a separation issue? Or does scientific investigation sometimes find support for the idea that an intelligent creator exists? Are such questions bleak and meaningless, and sometimes bad questions for science, as some atheists assert, or is the meaning to be found, after all,